buried alive. Just the thought is enough to send chills down your spine. A boy trapped beneath the earth, fighting for air, while the world above carries on unaware. It's a story that grips you instantly, filled with terror, survival, and questions that refuse to fade. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know. In the early hours of an October morning in Phoenix, Arizona, the absence of a small boy, Angel Torrez, quickly turned from worry into panic. Family members noticed he had not been seen for hours, and the usual sounds of his play were missing from the neighborhood. When calls into the street brought no answer, they alerted the police. Officers arrived within minutes, canvassing the neighborhood while neighbors joined in the desperate search. At first, those who looked for him assumed he had wandered off or been taken. No one could have imagined the reality. As the morning passed into noon, tension spread through the block. Patrol cars circled, volunteers combed through alleys and vacant lots. Then, in the early afternoon, a neighbor noticed a patch of disturbed earth in a nearby lot, the kind of uneven ground that seemed out of place against the flat, dusty surroundings. It was a small detail, easy to miss, but curiosity drew attention to it. Digging began almost immediately, and within moments, the truth was uncovered. Beneath the soil, a child's body lay hidden. It was Angel, buried alive, his small form pressed under layers of dirt. Gasps of disbelief turned into a frantic effort to free him. Hands clawed at the earth, pulling him into the daylight. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow, his skin cold and pale. Yet against all odds, he was alive. The Phoenix Fire Department rushed to the scene, paramedics moving with precision and urgency. Oxygen was administered, his airway cleared, his frail body wrapped to preserve what warmth he still carried. Witnesses later recalled the mixture of horror and relief that spread across the faces of those who stood nearby. The boy who had been feared lost was found, though clinging only faintly to life. Within minutes, Angel was placed into an ambulance and rushed toward Phoenix Children's Hospital. Sirens cut through the air as news crews began to converge on the lot. Reporters, tipped off by police radio, were already preparing their stories. Some described the burial site as a shallow grave, while others insisted the boy had nearly suffocated beneath several inches of earth. None disputed the shock. This was no accident. From the first official word, authorities confirmed foul play. By mid-afternoon, Phoenix police issued a statement confirming the discovery. The child had been found alive but gravely injured, now under critical care at the hospital. The word spread quickly across Arizona, breaking into national wires within hours. A boy had been buried alive and somehow survived. The moment Angel was lifted from the earth, the responsibility of keeping him alive fell squarely on the shoulders of Phoenix's first responders. Paramedics and firefighters rushed in, their boots kicking up dust as they carried equipment toward the small boy's still body. Time mattered. Every second spent under the dirt had drained oxygen from his blood, and his chest rose in shallow, irregular gasps. One medic slid an oxygen mask over his face, adjusting the valve with quick hands, while another checked for a pulse. The rhythm was faint but present, enough to push the team into a full-scale effort. Firefighters cleared the surrounding ground, marking off the area as police began stringing tape. Officers spoke in clipped, urgent tones, directing the crowd of neighbors to stay back while emergency workers focused on the child. In those first moments, no one was thinking about evidence or procedure. The only priority was to keep Angel alive long enough to reach the hospital. A firefighter cradled the boy's small body as paramedics prepared the stretcher. His skin was cold, his clothes packed with dirt, his eyelashes clumped with soil that had nearly sealed his eyes shut. A woman from the neighborhood wept openly, pressing her hands to her mouth as she watched. One of the officers guided her away, his own voice heavy, repeating that they needed space. The ambulance doors were thrown open, and Angel was carefully transferred inside. Monitors flickered on, wires and tubes connected in swift sequence. The lead paramedic called out his vitals to a partner, noting the dangerously low oxygen saturation. In the back of the vehicle, they worked steadily, giving rescue breaths and pressing warm blankets against his skin. A second ambulance, carrying additional equipment, followed closely behind. Outside the taped-off lot, reporters had already begun to gather, their cameras pointed at the commotion. Residents stood shoulder to shoulder, straining for glimpses of the boy they all knew from the block. For them, this was not just a story. This was a child whose laughter had echoed in their yards, now clinging to life in the back of an emergency vehicle. The convoy sped toward Phoenix Children's Hospital, sirens cutting through the thick afternoon air. Police units escorted the ambulances, ensuring a clear path through traffic. Inside, the paramedics continued their work, keeping him breathing, willing his body to hold on until the hospital staff could take over. By the time the ambulance reached the emergency bay, doctors and nurses were already waiting. The team transferred him in a flurry of motion, wheeling the stretcher through automatic doors and into the trauma unit. Outside, officers kept reporters at a distance while detectives remained at the vacant lot, beginning the slow process of documenting the ground where Angel had been found. What had started as a desperate rescue was now also a crime scene. Even before Angel had fully arrived at Phoenix Children's Hospital, the story had begun to spread. Reporters stationed at the vacant lot relayed hurried details back to their newsrooms, describing a missing boy found buried beneath the ground. The first television bulletins interrupted regular programming, their anchors speaking with a mixture of astonishment and gravity. The phrasing varied from one outlet to another. Some called it a shallow grave. Others said he had been buried alive under several inches of dirt. But the essential fact was the same. A child had been pulled from the earth and had survived. The images that appeared on local broadcasts were raw. A line of yellow police tape flapped in the wind, and beyond it, dark patches of overturned soil marked the spot where neighbors had dug. Fire trucks and patrol cars crowded the edge of the lot, their flashing lights cutting across the dusty street. From behind the tape, microphones pushed toward shaken residents who had witnessed the rescue. Their voices trembled as they tried to describe what they had seen. A tiny body lifted from the dirt, paramedics working desperately to bring him back. Within hours, the story crossed state lines. The Associated Press carried the first wire report, picked up by national outlets who stripped it down to a stark headline. Arizona boy found buried alive, survives. On the evening broadcasts, anchors in cities far from Phoenix spoke the boy's name, each struggling to capture the horror without slipping into speculation. The image of a child buried as if discarded was almost too difficult to comprehend. Yet the confirmation from police left no doubt. Local newspapers prepared expanded coverage for the morning editions. Drafts of front-page articles pieced together the timeline, the missing child report, the neighborhood search, the discovery in the vacant lot, and the ambulance race to the hospital. Editors debated how much detail was appropriate. Some writers wanted to emphasize the brutality of the act, others pressed for restraint, mindful that the boy's family would be reading those very words while waiting for updates at his hospital bedside. On Spanish-language radio stations in Phoenix, callers phoned in, many speaking with a mix of outrage and sorrow. For the Latino community where the Torrez family was known, the story was personal. Hosts reminded listeners that the boy was still alive, still fighting, but the disbelief carried through every voice. ¿Quién haría algo así a un niño? Callers asked again and again. Who could do something like this to a child? Even as the first reports went out, officials tried to maintain control of the narrative. Police spokespeople confirmed only the essential details. A boy had been found, he was alive, he was in critical condition. Questions about who was responsible, or how long he had been under the dirt, were left unanswered. The deliberate silence fueled speculation, but authorities held firm, insisting that the priority was the boy's recovery and the integrity of the investigation. By nightfall, the story was firmly set in the public imagination. Across Phoenix, television screens replayed the same shaky footage of the vacant lot under floodlights, officers pacing between marked evidence flags, neighbors standing in small groups with their arms folded tightly against their chests. The boy's name was repeated with a kind of hushed reverence, and though the circumstances were shocking, one fact offered a fragile sense of hope. Against all odds, Angel Torrez had survived. At the center of the chaos, beyond the flashing lights and the flood of cameras, was a family that could barely process what had happened. For them, The story was not unfolding on a television screen or in newspaper headlines. It was unfolding in real time, each moment dragging between hope and despair. When Angel was first reported missing, his parents had done what any family would do. They searched every corner of the house, called out into the street, and then begged neighbors for help. The hours of not knowing had been unbearable. When police finally told them he had been found, the relief was tempered by horror. He had not been discovered wandering the neighborhood or hiding in a friend's yard. He had been buried alive, pulled from the earth by strangers who had no reason ever to have to dig up a child. Family members rushed to the hospital, following the ambulance convoy, clutching at one another in disbelief. In later interviews, they described the scene as a blur. The frantic ride, the endless hallways, the waiting outside trauma doors while doctors worked. Some recalled the sound of machines and the sight of their son's body carried past them. Covered in dirt, his face pale and still. They remembered the weight of the oxygen mask pressed against him, the paramedics' hands never leaving his chest as they guided him deeper into the hospital. Relatives spoke quietly to reporters in the days that followed, often through tears. They called Angel a playful, energetic child, one who never strayed far from home and who was loved not only by his parents but by cousins, aunts, and grandparents who lived nearby. The idea that someone could deliberately place him in the ground was unthinkable to them. More than once, they repeated the same phrase, "He is just a little boy." It was a reminder that behind the headlines and police briefings was a child who should have been safe in his own neighborhood. For the family, the hospital waiting room became a second home. They clung to every update from doctors, every flicker of improvement in his condition. Supporters arrived with food, with prayers, with words of encouragement whispered through tears. The shock of the community poured into those sterile corridors, surrounding the family in a mixture of grief and solidarity. In interviews given much later, after the initial panic had eased, the boy's relatives expressed both gratitude and exhaustion. They thanked the neighbors who had searched, the stranger who noticed the disturbed earth, the first responders who had refused to give up. But they also struggled to answer the question every journalist asked them. Why? No answer ever seemed enough. They were left, like everyone else, staring into the void of a crime that had nearly taken their child without warning or explanation. For his parents, the days after the burial were marked not only by fear but by a quiet determination. They sat by his hospital bed, holding his hand, whispering his name, believing that if he could hear their voices he might find the strength to stay. Their faith in his survival was unshaken, even as doctors warned them of the seriousness of his injuries. To lose him after he had already been pulled back from the earth was a possibility too cruel to accept. For the neighbors, the memory of that day lingered like a scar etched into the landscape of their community. It began with confusion, the sudden rush of police cars into their quiet street, the sound of officers knocking on doors and calling out questions. Most had joined the search without hesitation, fanning out through alleys, checking behind fences, and walking in pairs through vacant lots. At first, they assumed the boy had simply wandered off, as children sometimes did, and that he would soon be found with scraped knees and a sheepish smile. When the call went up from the lot nearby, curiosity drew them closer. Some had been standing only yards away when the first handfuls of dirt were scraped aside. They saw the outline of a child's body being uncovered, the sudden shift from searching to rescuing, and the frantic pace of digging with bare hands. For those present, the image never left them. The sight of a small figure lifted from the ground, limp and covered in soil, as if the earth itself had tried to swallow him. Later, when asked by reporters to describe what they saw, the neighbors struggled for words. Some spoke in fragments, repeating how unreal it felt, how no one could believe such a thing had happened on their street. Others recounted the details with painful clarity. The silence of the crowd as paramedics placed the oxygen mask, the sharp orders of firefighters demanding space, the sound of the ambulance doors slamming shut. One woman who had lived across from the vacant lot described how her knees gave way the moment she realized the boy had been buried. She had seen him playing outside days earlier, his laughter echoing between the houses. The thought that someone had placed him beneath the dirt was more than she could bear. She recalled praying aloud, her hands trembling, as the paramedics carried him past her. Another neighbor, who had been among those searching, remembered the exact patch of disturbed ground that caught his attention. He told police he noticed the soil looked freshly turned, darker and looser than the rest. At first, he thought it might have been from a dog digging or children playing. But when they scraped at the surface, he realized it was far more serious. His voice broke when he told reporters he wished he had looked sooner. The atmosphere in the neighborhood that night was heavy with disbelief. Families stood outside long after police had left, whispering to one another in clusters, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. Parents held their children tighter, warning them not to stray even a few feet from the porch. The vacant lot, once an unremarkable patch of dirt and weeds, had become something else entirely, a reminder of how fragile safety could be. Days later, when news crews returned to gather follow-up reactions, neighbors still struggled to process the event. Some were reluctant to speak, shaking their heads and closing their doors. Others spoke in anger, demanding answers and justice. They wanted to know who had done this, how it had happened, and why no one had seen anything sooner. The disbelief had hardened into a determination that such a crime should never happen again. Not on their street, not to any child. The witnesses carried the burden of what they had seen. For them, Angel's rescue was not a headline but a living memory of dirt-streaked skin, muffled cries, and the sound of sirens fading into the distance. They had stood on the edge of life and death, powerless to do more than dig with their hands and pray that it wasn't already too late. For the men and women who arrived in uniform that afternoon, the rescue of Angel Torrez became one of those calls that never left them. Firefighters and paramedics had responded to countless emergencies. Fires, crashes, medical crises, but few had ever been faced with a child buried alive. Even years later, some would admit that the memory of pulling him from the dirt stayed sharper than most of their other calls. The first firefighter on scene later described the urgency that swept over the crew the moment they saw the boy's body. Training told them to secure the scene, to preserve evidence, to wait for command, but instinct pushed them forward. They dropped to their knees in the dust, clearing away the earth with their hands. There was no time for protocol. The boy's life outweighed everything. Paramedics recalled how still he was when they lifted him free. His skin was gray, his lips tinged blue, and for a breathless moment, they feared they were too late. Then, faintly, they felt it, the fragile rhythm of a pulse. That single sign sparked a surge of determination. They opened their kits on the dirt beside him, sliding an oxygen mask over his face, attaching monitors, and calling out vitals with clipped, urgent voices. One medic later told colleagues that he could hear the sound of his own heartbeat in his ears as he worked. He remembered the dirt clinging to the boy's eyelashes, the way his small chest rose and fell unevenly, the shallow fight for air. He said the thought that echoed in his mind over and over was simple: this child cannot die here. Police officers on scene carried a different memory. While the medics focused on life-saving care, officers were forced to think ahead to the grim reality that someone had put the boy there deliberately. One officer admitted that as he helped hold back the crowd of neighbors, he kept looking over his shoulder at the hole in the ground, wondering what kind of person could dig it. When the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle roared toward the hospital, the responders left behind at the lot began their own work. Detectives marked off the disturbed soil, technicians photographed every angle, and officers canvassed the area for anyone who had seen or heard something suspicious. But for the paramedics in the back of that ambulance, nothing existed beyond the boy on the stretcher. They rode with their hands on his chest, their eyes fixed on the monitor, urging each small flicker of life to hold. At Phoenix Children's Hospital, emergency staff were waiting. Doctors and nurses later spoke of how quickly the paramedics relayed the boy's condition, their voices steady but edged with urgency. They passed along details of the burial, the possible oxygen deprivation, the unknown length of time underground. The handoff was rapid, but not without a sense of relief. The child had made it this far, and now he was in the hands of specialists. For many of the first responders, the call ended there, but the memory did not. Some said they avoided that street for months afterward, unable to shake the image of the boy lying in the earth. Others spoke of him with a kind of reverence, as if his survival was a reminder of why they chose their work in the first place. They carried countless tragedies in their careers, but this one stood apart. They had seen a child pulled from the ground, alive against every odd, and that vision would never fade. At Phoenix Children's Hospital, the gravity of the situation became clear the moment Angel was wheeled through the emergency doors. Dirt still clung to his hair, his clothing was stiff with soil, and his skin carried the gray pallor of a child who had gone without oxygen for far too long. Doctors and nurses moved quickly, transferring him from the stretcher to the trauma bed, attaching monitors and establishing 4 lines. The air in the room was tense but focused, every person present aware that the margin between life and death was razor thin. The first priority was to stabilize his breathing. Paramedics had managed to keep his airway open and deliver oxygen during the ride, but his lungs struggled with every intake. Physicians inserted a breathing tube and connected him to a ventilator, forcing regular breaths into his small body. His chest rose and fell with the machine's rhythm, a fragile sign that his body had not yet given up. Blood work was ordered immediately, and results confirmed what the team had feared. Angel's oxygen levels were dangerously low, and his blood showed clear evidence of hypoxia. The doctors knew that prolonged oxygen deprivation, even for a few minutes, could cause permanent brain damage. The uncertainty of how long he had been buried weighed heavily on every decision they made. As scans were prepared, nurses worked to warm his body. The hours underground had lowered his temperature, leaving him in a state of hypothermia. Heated blankets were layered over him, warm fluids administered through 4 lines, and his skin slowly began to regain color. Even so, his condition was listed as critical. The medical team noted bruising along his body, consistent with pressure from the soil that had covered him. Dirt was carefully cleaned from his mouth, nose, and ears, the remnants of his burial still clinging stubbornly to him as though the earth itself resisted letting go. Every detail was documented, not only for his care but also for investigators waiting outside the trauma unit, aware that these injuries might later speak in court. Doctors discussed the possibilities in hushed tones. If Angel had been deprived of oxygen for too long, he might never fully recover. Brain scans would be necessary, and time itself would reveal the extent of any neurological damage. For now, the focus was survival, keeping his heart steady, his lungs working, his temperature stable. Family members were allowed brief visits, ushered in 2 or 3 at a time. They stood quietly by his bed, whispering his name, touching his hand, willing him to open his eyes. Nurses noted how his pulse quickened slightly when his parents spoke, a small but hopeful sign that he was still responsive to the world around him. Throughout the night, the hospital remained a fortress of silence. Reporters crowded outside, pressing for details, but officials released only the basics. The child was alive, he was in critical condition, and he was receiving intensive care. Behind those words lay the uncertainty of medicine, the fragile balance of machines and human while keeping Angel tethered to life. In those first 24 hours, the outcome remained unknown. Some doctors quietly admitted to colleagues that they had prepared themselves for the worst. Others refused to give up, pointing to the child's stubborn pulse, his body's refusal to let go even after being buried alive. Against all medical expectation, Angel had already survived the impossible. The question now was whether his body could withstand the fight still ahead. While doctors fought to keep Angel alive in the hospital, investigators and forensic teams remained at the vacant lot, working late into the night under portable floodlights. The patch of ground where the boy had been found was cordoned off, the soil marked with numbered evidence flags. Technicians knelt in the dirt, photographing the disturbed earth from every angle before carefully scraping samples into labeled bags. What for neighbors had been a scene of shock was, for investigators, now a crime scene to be dissected in detail. The burial site was a shallow depression, roughly the length of a small child. The soil was loose and dry, typical of Phoenix ground, with scattered stones and patches of weeds. Investigators noted that the soil directly over Angel's body was softer than the surrounding ground, suggesting it had been dug and replaced recently. Measurements later recorded the depth as only a few inches above his body, enough to trap him, but not deep enough to conceal him for long. It was this detail that explained how a neighbor had spotted the difference in the soil, and why Angel had been found before it was too late. Forensic experts studied the compaction of the dirt, determining how much weight pressed against his chest. Even a few inches of soil could restrict a child's breathing, and in Angel's case, the pressure combined with the lack of oxygen had pushed him into a state of near suffocation. Small traces of dirt were collected from his clothing, his hair, and even inside his lungs. These samples would later confirm that he had been alive when buried, inhaling soil particles as he struggled for air. Investigators also examined the edges of the burial pit. The marks were irregular, as if dug quickly with a hand or improvised tool rather than a proper shovel. This suggested haste and panic more than careful planning. The soil bore fingerprints of movement, shifts, collapses, and uneven ridges left behind by whoever had placed the child there. The surrounding lot was surveyed for footprints. In the dust, faint impressions revealed the path of at least one adult. Some tracks led in from the street, others circled the site before fading into harder ground. Plaster casts were taken, though the prints were incomplete, eroded by the day's activity and the frantic rescue. Still, they became part of the growing file. Experts later explained how survival in such conditions, even briefly, was nearly impossible. With each breath, the air beneath the soil grew thinner, the chest compressed, the lungs fought for space, and the body cooled rapidly. That Angel had endured long enough to be discovered and rescued was described by one forensic pathologist as a rare intersection of timing and luck. If the burial had been a few inches deeper, or if discovery had been delayed even a short while, the outcome would have been different. The lot itself became a landmark in the days that followed. Police vehicles remained stationed there, evidence markers still planted in the earth, while journalists stood just beyond the tape-pointing cameras at the ground where the child had been found. Forensic teams returned multiple times, each visit peeling back another layer of dirt in search of clues. They sifted soil for fibers, for small fragments, for anything that might connect the crime to a suspect. In the sterile language of forensic reports, the place was reduced to measurements and observations, depths, soil composition, particle analysis. But beneath that technical detail lay a darker truth. Someone had chosen that ground as a grave for a living child. The investigators walked away each night with the weight of that fact heavy on their shoulders, knowing the evidence buried in that dirt carried the key to explaining how Angel had survived and who had tried to ensure he wouldn't. As the immediate rescue gave way to investigation, experts from multiple fields began to weigh in on what had happened. Reporters turned to medical specialists, forensic scientists, and child safety advocates, asking the same question again and again. How could a child survive being buried alive? The answers were sobering. Medical professionals explained that Angel's survival hinged on several fragile factors. The shallow depth of the burial allowed a small but critical pocket of air to remain around his face. The looseness of the soil also played a role. Because it was not tightly packed, small amounts of oxygen could seep through. One pediatric pulmonologist interviewed by local media noted that a child's lungs are surprisingly resilient, able to function with lower oxygen intake for short periods. But she also stressed that even a few minutes of suffocation can cause irreversible brain injury. In her words, Angel's survival was an exception, not an expectation. Forensic scientists echoed this. They described the physical stress of soil pressing against the chest and abdomen, restricting the natural rise and fall needed to breathe. They compared it to being pinned under debris, except that, in this case, every attempted breath also risked drawing dirt into the airways. That Angel was pulled out alive suggested not only a fast rescue but also remarkable physiological endurance. Emergency response experts highlighted the role of rapid intervention. The neighbors' vigilance, the 911 call, and the quick arrival of firefighters all narrowed the timeline. A fire captain who later spoke about the case admitted that, when he first saw the child covered in earth, he expected the worst. It was the faint movement of Angel's chest that spurred the team to act without hesitation. Had they paused even briefly to assess, he might not have made it. Child welfare advocates in interviews that followed pointed to a broader concern. how a child could vanish from sight and end up buried in the first place. To them, the case raised not only medical or forensic questions but also societal ones. Was this an isolated act of cruelty, or did it point to larger issues of neglect, supervision, or violence in the community? Their commentary expanded the story beyond a single family's tragedy, framing it as a warning about the vulnerabilities children face. Psychologists brought yet another perspective. They warned that even if Angel made a full physical recovery, the trauma of such an experience could linger. A child buried alive might carry memories, fragmented, sensory, or subconscious, that could shape his development for years to come. They spoke of nightmares, anxiety, and the need for long-term therapy. In their analysis, the survival was only the first battle. Healing the mind and emotions would be the longer war. Even law enforcement specialists added their voices, though cautiously. They noted that the manner of burial, shallow, hurried, unskilled, hinted at desperation rather than planning. This suggested an assailant who acted impulsively, under stress, or perhaps without full understanding of the act's consequences. Still, they refrained from drawing conclusions too early, reminding the public that evidence, not speculation, would guide the case. In the end, expert commentary painted a picture that was both miraculous and haunting. Angel's survival was explained in terms of soil density, air pockets, rapid medical intervention, and child physiology. But every explanation was paired with a reminder of how unlikely it was. Specialists agreed on one thing: this was not a story of ordinary endurance. It was a razor's-edge escape from certain death, a case that would be studied precisely because the outcome defied expectation. Detectives from the Phoenix Police Department took charge of the case the moment Angel was stabilized in the hospital. What had begun as a rescue had now become a criminal investigation, and every detail mattered. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, moving from door to door, asking residents what they had seen in the hours before the boy was discovered. Witness accounts varied. Some neighbors said they had noticed a man lingering near the vacant lot earlier in the day. Though descriptions were vague, some recalled dark clothing, others remembered a hat. Another resident reported hearing muffled crying around midday but admitted she had dismissed it, assuming it was a child playing. These fragments of memory were collected and logged, but none provided a clear picture of who had placed Angel in the dirt. Detectives paid close attention to Angel's family, not because they suspected them outright, but because statistics pointed inward. Most crimes against children came from people known to them. Officers spoke with his parents, carefully recording their accounts of the day. The parents, visibly shaken, repeated their confusion and horror at what had happened. Angel, they said, had been playing outside before he vanished. When he did not return, they searched frantically, believing at first he might have wandered off. They had not imagined he was so close, hidden beneath the very ground. Investigators checked for potential custody disputes, domestic issues, or conflicts within the family circle. Background checks were run, interviews conducted with relatives and close acquaintances. While nothing immediately incriminating emerged, detectives were trained not to rule anything out too soon. The case file grew thicker with every statement collected. Meanwhile, the lot itself became the focus of forensic and tactical analysis. Detectives walked the perimeter, considering how someone could carry out the act without being seen. The ground offered few hiding places, and the area was visible from multiple houses. This suggested either a brazen perpetrator or a very narrow window of opportunity. Police theorized that whoever buried Angel had counted on no one looking too closely at the soil, believing the act would go unnoticed. Attention also turned to the possibility of strangers, contractors, drifters, or others who might have passed through the neighborhood. Patrol logs were reviewed for reports of suspicious individuals in the days prior. Detectives interviewed utility workers, landscapers, and delivery drivers who had routes through the area. Each was questioned, their movements checked against the timeline of Angel's disappearance. Inside the police department, task force meetings stretched late into the night. Maps of the area were pinned to bulletin boards, marked with potential sightlines and witness locations. The burial site was photographed repeatedly, images circulated among investigators for study. Detectives debated theories. Was this an attempted homicide? an act of abuse, or a misguided attempt to hide a child temporarily. Despite the uncertainty, one fact united them. The act was deliberate. A child does not bury himself. Someone had placed Angel in the ground and covered him with soil. Whether the intent was to kill, to frighten, or to conceal, it was a crime that demanded resolution. The urgency of finding a suspect pressed on the team, even as the evidence trickled in slowly, incomplete and fragile. Every officer involved understood the stakes. They were not simply solving a case. They were seeking justice for a child who had survived what few ever do. Each unanswered question fueled their determination, even as the investigation unfolded with more shadows than clarity. News of Angel's rescue spread rapidly, first across Phoenix and then across the country. Television crews gathered outside Phoenix Children's Hospital, their cameras fixed on the doors in hopes of capturing updates from doctors or family members. Reporters repeated the few confirmed details. Angel had been found buried alive. He was in critical condition, and police were searching for answers. Beyond that, speculation filled the gaps, and headlines sharpened the story into a narrative of miracle and outrage. The public's reaction was immediate and emotional. Social media platforms overflowed with prayers, messages of support, and demands for accountability. Parents across Arizona confessed to checking on their children more often, shaken by the idea that such a crime could happen in broad daylight within an ordinary neighborhood. Hashtags calling for justice trended locally, amplifying pressure on investigators who were still working with limited evidence. Community groups organized vigils outside the hospital. Candles were lit, signs were raised with messages like, "Justice for Angel," and "Protect our children." Strangers left stuffed animals, flowers, and handwritten notes near the hospital entrance, tokens of solidarity for a boy they had never met. Inside, hospital staff quietly acknowledged how unusual it was for a single patient to draw such a public outpouring, but no one doubted the sincerity behind it. At the same time, frustration grew. Commentators on talk radio and local news questioned how a child could vanish, be buried, and nearly die without anyone noticing. Some blamed parents for not watching closely enough, others faulted neighbors for ignoring signs, while still others directed anger at law enforcement for not having answers fast enough. The debate turned the tragedy into a public spectacle, with opinion often outpacing fact. Detectives felt the weight of that scrutiny daily. Press conferences were scheduled to manage the narrative, with police spokespeople repeating cautious statements. The investigation was active, multiple leads were being followed, and updates would come when confirmed. Still, reporters pressed harder, asking about suspects, motives, and whether Angel's case connected to any broader pattern of crimes. Each time officials declined to speculate, the refusal only seemed to fuel more speculation outside official channels. Political figures added their voices. City leaders issued statements condemning the act and praising first responders. State officials promised resources and oversight. These gestures, while well-meaning, also raised expectations that the case would be solved quickly. Inside the department, investigators bristled at the pressure, knowing complex cases rarely moved at the speed of public opinion. For Angel's family, the media presence was a double-edged sword. The attention brought community support and donations for medical care, but it also placed them under a harsh spotlight. Reporters camped outside their home, asking for comment, analyzing their body language, and in some cases, questioning their version of events. Police quietly reminded the press that the family was not accused of wrongdoing, but the swirl of suspicion and curiosity was difficult to contain once unleashed. Within days, the case had transformed from a local emergency into a national story, framed as both miracle and mystery. Angel's survival inspired awe, but the unanswered question, who buried him, turned that awe into anger. Every day that passed without an arrest deepened the sense of urgency. Detectives knew that solving the case was no longer only a matter of justice. It had become a matter of public trust. The first wave of tips came in within hours of the story breaking. The police tip line was flooded, hundreds of calls from citizens convinced they had seen something suspicious or knew someone capable of the crime. Detectives triaged each call, separating vague suspicions from potentially actionable information. Many of the leads, however, dissolved almost immediately. One caller swore she had seen a stranger digging in the lot days before Angel was found, but when investigators checked, her timeline did not match. Another insisted a disgruntled neighbor had a history of violence, but background checks revealed nothing beyond minor disputes. Some calls were more speculative than factual, reflecting the anxieties stirred up by media coverage. Even the descriptions of a man in dark clothing near the lot fractured under scrutiny. Different witnesses placed him at different times, described his features inconsistently, and disagreed on whether he had been carrying tools or not. Without surveillance footage to corroborate, the figure became less a suspect and more a ghost of rumor, seen but never pinned down. Detectives turned back to the family, hoping for clarity. Interviews were repeated, details cross-checked against each other, but nothing shifted suspicion decisively. Parents and relatives produced consistent accounts, and no evidence suggested direct involvement. Though investigators maintained an open mind, they faced the risk of alienating the very people most invested in Angel's recovery. Forensic testing offered little relief. Soil samples from the burial site were bagged and analyzed, but no foreign objects or trace evidence, fibers, fingerprints, or footprints, emerged clearly. The ground itself was too disturbed by rescue efforts to yield precise impressions. If a shovel had been used, no tool marks survived the commotion of digging Angel out. It was as though the earth had swallowed its own secrets. At the hospital, investigators hoped Angel himself might provide answers once stable. But the boy was too young and too traumatized to explain what had happened. Doctors cautioned against pressing him, fearing that questioning could deepen his distress. For detectives, it was a bitter frustration. The only direct witness could not yet speak for himself. The strain began to show. Task force meetings circled the same uncertain theories. Was this a targeted attack or random violence? Was the perpetrator an outsider or someone close? Each possibility had weight, but none had evidence strong enough to advance. As days turned into weeks, the public grew restless. Critics accused police of incompetence, while detectives quietly acknowledged that they had reached an investigative wall. Some leads even proved to be deliberate distractions. A handful of callers gave false names or fabricated stories, wasting time and resources. Others seemed motivated by personal grudges, pointing fingers at neighbors or acquaintances with no basis. Detectives sifted through each with patience, but morale dipped with every dead end. The most unsettling breakdown came from the lack of physical evidence itself. In most violent crimes, there were traces, skin cells, hair, objects left behind. Here, there was almost nothing. Whoever had buried Angel had either been remarkably careful or astonishingly lucky. For investigators, that absence became its own kind of clue. The act may not have been sophisticated, but it had been executed in a way that left virtually nothing behind. By the close of the initial investigative phase, the case file was thick but inconclusive. There were notes, witness statements, and photographs, but no clear path forward. The boy was alive, his family desperate for closure, and the community demanding justice. Yet the story was suspended in uncertainty, each lead collapsing under its own fragility, leaving detectives chasing shadows. The doctors who first treated Angel spoke quietly about the odds he had faced. Surviving suffocation, dehydration, and the shock of being buried alive was something they had rarely encountered, if ever. His body carried the evidence of that ordeal. Lungs struggling for air, skin bruised from pressure, and eyes that blinked slowly against the bright hospital lights. Stabilizing him was the first victory, but recovery would be far more complicated. In the weeks after his rescue, Angel's treatment focused on his respiratory system. Fine particles of dirt had entered his airways, causing inflammation that made every breath a test of endurance. Machines helped regulate his oxygen intake, while nurses monitored his lungs around the clock. At times, his breathing seemed to falter, sending staff rushing into his room. Each episode left his family on edge, fearing that survival could still slip away. Nutrition became another hurdle. Hours without air and water had weakened him, and his small body had to be nourished carefully to avoid further stress. Specialists mapped out feeding plans, adjusting slowly as his body regained strength. For Angel's parents, who had once struggled just to convince him to finish a plate of food at home, the sight of doctors measuring every calorie was both surreal and painful. Beyond the physical care, doctors raised concerns about long-term neurological impact. Lack of oxygen, even for a short time, could cause lasting damage. Scans and evaluations were scheduled, with each test hovering like a silent judgment on the boy's future. His family celebrated small signs of progress. A squeeze of the hand, a glance toward a familiar voice, the faintest effort to lift his head. These moments reassured them that he was still present, still fighting, even if the road ahead was uncertain. As Angel's condition slowly improved, another set of professionals stepped into the picture: child welfare advocates. The nature of the crime forced hard questions about his safety, not just medically but socially. Investigators needed to ensure that he could return to a stable, secure environment once released from the hospital. Social workers visited the family repeatedly, interviewing parents, observing dynamics, and assessing whether there had been any lapses in supervision that might have allowed the crime to happen. The visits were a source of tension. While the family welcomed support, they also felt scrutinized at a moment of profound vulnerability. They insisted that they had done everything possible to protect Angel, that what happened was the work of an unknown predator. For social workers, the goal was not accusation but prevention, ensuring that when Angel left the hospital, he would be safe. Still, the interviews left his parents weary, as though their love and vigilance were being weighed on a scale. In the community, donations and fundraising drives helped cover medical costs, but the outpouring also raised questions about what kind of ongoing care Angel might need. If there were cognitive or physical delays, therapy could be required for years. The family braced for those possibilities, determined to give him every chance at recovery. Doctors continued to stress that progress would not be linear. Good days could be followed by setbacks. Energy gained could be drained overnight. The medical team encouraged patience, but patience was a scarce resource for a family that had already endured the unimaginable. Each day felt like a test, and each night ended with the same whispered prayer: that Angel would wake stronger than he had been the day before. Even as Angel's body began to recover, it became clear that his ordeal had left invisible wounds. Nurses noticed that when the lights in his hospital room dimmed, he sometimes startled awake, gasping as if the darkness itself threatened to bury him again. Small sounds, a sudden knock on a door, the hum of a machine, could send his body into stiff, defensive stillness. The physical danger had passed, but the memory of it clung to him in ways no medical scan could measure. Psychologists who worked with children in crisis were brought in to observe. They explained gently to the family that trauma, especially at such a young age, could carve deep patterns into behavior. Some children became withdrawn, others clung tightly to parents, unable to be left alone even for a moment. Angel showed both tendencies, sometimes quiet to the point of silence, sometimes clutching at his mother's hand so firmly that she had to peel his fingers away just to step into the hallway. His drawings became another window into his state of mind. With crayons given to keep him occupied, he sketched scenes with heavy strokes of black and brown. Buried shapes appeared on the page, often with small figures looking upward toward light. Doctors and therapists noted that this was not unusual. Children who had endured trauma often expressed their memories through images before words. Each drawing, though haunting, was also evidence that he was trying to process what had happened. Sleep was fragile. Nightmares came often, leaving him sweating and disoriented. He sometimes woke crying, unable to articulate what frightened him. When asked gently by a therapist, he muttered fragments: "Dark, can't breathe, stuck," before retreating into silence. For those around him, it was a reminder that survival had not erased the experience. The earth had closed over him once, and in his mind, it threatened to do so again each night. For his parents, this was the most difficult part to witness. They could comfort him, hold him, reassure him that he was safe, but they could not erase the images that replayed in his mind. His father admitted in one interview that he felt helpless, that fixing a broken bone or a scraped knee had always been simple compared to this kind of invisible injury. His mother spoke of watching his eyes glaze over when conversation turned to ordinary things, as though part of him was still trapped in the ground. Specialists began therapy sessions designed for children his age. These focused not on forcing him to recount details, but on rebuilding a sense of safety. Routine was emphasized. Regular meals, consistent sleep schedules, predictable visits. Familiar objects, blankets, toys, family photos were kept close, serving as anchors against fear. Slowly, he responded to these measures, though setbacks were frequent. The wider community, eager to see him smiling again, sometimes struggled to understand the depth of his trauma. Visitors expected cheerful gratitude, but what they often encountered was a child still guarded, still processing. His reluctance was not ingratitude, but a sign of how profound the impact had been. Psychologists urged patience, reminding everyone that healing from trauma was not measured in weeks but in years. Angel's early signs of post-traumatic stress were unmistakable: hypervigilance, disturbed sleep, avoidance of places or people that reminded him of the event. Left unaddressed, these could follow him into adulthood. But those same specialists emphasized hope. Children, they explained, carried remarkable resilience when supported consistently. If his environment remained stable and nurturing, if therapy continued, if he was shielded from constant reminders, he could one day reclaim the sense of safety that had been stolen from him. When Angel was finally stable enough to leave the hospital, his family carried him out not into peace, but into a world that was already watching closely. Cameras had been following his story for weeks, and his survival had become a symbol of resilience across Phoenix. Neighbors, reporters, and even strangers wished the family well, but behind the encouragement came the pressure of living under constant public attention. At first, the support felt like a lifeline. Donations helped pay for medical bills, meals appeared on their doorstep, and people offered rides or childcare. Yet, as weeks turned into months, the family realized they could no longer separate their private lives from the public story that surrounded them. Everywhere they went, someone recognized them. A trip to the grocery store meant answering questions from curious onlookers. How is Angel doing? Was he eating again? Did he talk about what happened? The family wanted to be polite, but each question reopened wounds. The parents were forced to relive the ordeal in conversations they never asked to have. For Angel, hearing his story repeated by strangers made it harder to escape the memory. What had happened to him was not just a trauma but also, in the eyes of the community, a public event. Journalists continued to push for updates. Some requested interviews, others camped near the family home. The parents tried to protect their son from the spotlight, but their refusal sometimes drew criticism. A few outlets framed it as secrecy, questioning why the family would not share more about his recovery. The mother once remarked quietly to a social worker that it felt as though people had forgotten he was a child, not just a headline. Inside the home, the struggle to return to normal was even more complex. Nightmares still woke Angel, leaving the family sleep-deprived. His parents rearranged their work schedules to ensure he was never alone, a choice that strained finances despite community aid. Family dinners, once filled with chatter, were quieter now, punctuated by the effort to encourage him to eat, laugh, or play. His siblings, if they wanted attention, often had to wait. Much of the household revolved around Angel's needs: doctor appointments, therapy sessions, school adjustments. Though they loved him, the unspoken tension grew. Friends of the family noticed it, offering to take the other children for afternoons. But the parents found it difficult to accept help, feeling that every moment together was precious after almost losing their son. The pressure extended beyond the walls of their home. At school, teachers had been briefed about his trauma, and classmates treated him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Some wanted to be close to the boy who had survived the impossible, while others avoided him, whispering that his story was too strange, too frightening. He could feel the difference even if no one spoke it directly. Public events were the hardest. On several occasions, Angel's name was invoked at community gatherings, often as a symbol of hope or resilience. His parents sat stiffly in folding chairs, applauding when expected, but inside they wished desperately to protect him from being turned into an emblem. Each mention was a reminder that their son's ordeal belonged not just to them, but to an entire city. Over time, the weight of scrutiny pressed harder. Rumors circulated about the family, some questioning whether they had enemies, others speculating about their past. Detectives had not revealed many details about the investigation, and in the absence of answers, speculation filled the silence. For a family already stretched thin by trauma, these whispers cut deeply. They wanted to move forward, to rebuild routines, but every knock on the door, every camera spotted near the street, every stranger's question reminded them of the night Angel was pulled from the earth. Returning to normal life was no longer about picking up where they had left off. It was about finding a new way to live, one that balanced private healing with the reality that their lives had become a matter of public record. The courtroom became the next stage where Angel's story unfolded, not through the quiet retelling of his family, but under the weight of legal arguments and public scrutiny. The state of Arizona pursued charges with determination, presenting the case not only as an assault on a child, but as an act so cruel that it demanded the full attention of the justice system. The man accused of burying Angel alive was brought before the court in chains, his face studied carefully by reporters who packed the benches. Prosecutors framed him as both violent and calculating, emphasizing that this was not a crime of impulse but of deliberate intent. They recounted the details gathered by investigators: the shallow grave, the makeshift binding, the evidence of premeditation. Each detail was presented to hammer home the point that Angel's survival was not a miracle alone, but a chance event in what was meant to be a certain death. Witnesses were called one by one. Police officers described the scene where Angel was discovered, their testimony underscoring the brutality of the act. One officer recalled the moment he first saw the boy's hand twitch under the dirt, an image that left jurors visibly shaken. Medical professionals testified next, outlining the injuries and the very real possibility that without immediate discovery, Angel would have suffocated. Their testimony carried the cold precision of science, yet each phrase underscored the fragile line between life and death. The defense attempted to cast doubt, suggesting that the accused had not fully understood the consequences of his actions, or that he had acted under the influence of substances. They argued that intent, the cornerstone of a charge as serious as attempted murder, was not as clear as prosecutors claimed. But prosecutors countered with forensic evidence and the testimony of detectives, who explained how carefully the burial site appeared to have been prepared. Throughout the trial, Angel himself was kept at a distance. Lawyers, psychologists, and child advocates agreed that placing him on the witness stand would expose him to re-traumatization. Instead, his presence was felt through reports, medical files, and the testimony of those who had cared for him. The jury never saw him in person, but the weight of his survival hung over the proceedings like a silent voice. The trial stretched over weeks, each day dissecting another element of the crime. Photographs of the site were displayed, leaving jurors to stare at images of the dirt-covered ground where the boy had been hidden. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavy, not just with the details of the crime, but with the recognition that this was not a case of theft or fraud, or even a random act of violence. It was something more calculated, more intimate, and therefore more terrifying. When closing arguments came, the prosecution implored the jury to remember not just the evidence but the human cost. They reminded the panel that the boy's survival should not lessen the severity of the crime, that the act itself was the measure of guilt. The defense, in turn, warned against being swept away by emotion, insisting that the legal system required proof of intent beyond a reasonable doubt. As jurors filed out to deliberate, the room held a silence broken only by the sound of shuffling papers and distant footsteps. For Angel's family, waiting was another form of torment, though they had grown accustomed to it in the months since the burial. The trial had given structure to their suffering, but the verdict would determine whether justice, as the law defined it, had truly been served. Even before the trial reached its conclusion, the media had transformed Angel's story into a symbol. Local stations in Phoenix led with his case night after night, and national outlets soon followed, drawn by the chilling image of a child rescued from the earth itself. At first, coverage centered on the sheer horror of the crime and the miracle of survival. Headlines carried words like unthinkable and unimaginable, framing Angel as both victim and survivor. As weeks passed, the tone of coverage began to shift. Reporters sought new angles, revisiting details of the crime, sometimes with repetition that bordered on exploitation. They produced timelines, animated reconstructions of the burial site, and expert panels speculating on the psychology of someone who could commit such an act. Angel's name appeared everywhere, his story folded into morning news teasers, magazine features, and late-night commentary. Spanish-language media played an especially important role. In many Latino households, Angel's survival was not just news but a deeply personal story, one that reflected shared fears about vulnerability and resilience. Coverage in Spanish outlets often emphasized community support, the strength of his family, and the cultural responsibility to protect children. English-language reporting, meanwhile, leaned more heavily on the sensational, highlighting the grisly details and positioning the case within broader conversations about crime in Phoenix. The closer the trial came to its conclusion, the more the coverage framed the case as a litmus test for justice. Talk shows debated the strength of the prosecution's arguments. Editorials questioned how such a crime could occur in a residential neighborhood without earlier intervention. Some reports turned toward policy, asking what protections were in place for children and whether warning signs had been overlooked. Not all coverage was sympathetic. A handful of tabloids questioned the family itself, scrutinizing their background, their parenting, and their willingness to speak or not speak to the press. These stories hurt the most, not because they uncovered anything new, but because they treated grief and survival as commodities. The family felt trapped, their silence interpreted as mystery, their openness consumed as spectacle. Angel remained absent from the cameras, shielded by both his family and court restrictions. Still, his presence hovered over every broadcast. When anchors referred to the boy who was buried alive, no further explanation was needed. His name had become shorthand for one of the most haunting crimes in recent Arizona history. As sentencing approached, coverage shifted again, focusing on what punishment would be sufficient for such an act. News stations replayed footage of police describing Angel's rescue, juxtaposed against courtroom sketches of the accused. Pundits argued whether a lengthy sentence would offer true justice, or whether nothing could balance the cruelty of what had been attempted. By the time the verdict was read, the case had become more than a local crime story. It had entered the larger archive of American true crime, a story retold in documentaries, special reports, and eventually crime anthologies. Each retelling emphasized different details, some highlighting resilience, others focusing on brutality. Yet across all versions, one constant remained: the image of a child clawing his way back to life from beneath the dirt, and a city forced to reckon with the fact that such darkness had unfolded in its midst. When the trial concluded and the cameras dimmed, the official record of Angel's case seemed, at first glance, to be complete. Yet as journalists and legal observers revisited the transcripts, reports, and press briefings, inconsistencies began to surface. The details of what had happened to Angel were not always aligned, and depending on whether one read a police report, listened to a prosecutor's summary, or studied court testimony, subtle contradictions appeared. Police reports from the day of the rescue described the burial site as shallow, barely enough to conceal the child. Yet, in later testimony, officers emphasized how tightly packed the dirt had been, noting that extraction required careful digging. Prosecutors leaned on this latter account, suggesting premeditation and intent to suffocate, while defense attorneys pointed back to the earlier reports, arguing that inconsistencies weakened the state's narrative. There were also discrepancies about the timeline. In some accounts, officers claimed they arrived within minutes of the 911 call, suggesting an almost immediate response. But dispatch logs later revealed a longer gap, raising questions about whether initial delays had been minimized in official retellings. Community members who had been present that day described watching officers struggle with confusion over jurisdiction, something not reflected in the polished courtroom summaries. Medical testimony carried its own contradictions. Emergency physicians described Angel's condition as critical, suggesting he had only moments to live when discovered. Yet later reports softened that description, with one doctor noting that while the boy was in serious danger, the exact margin between life and death could not be measured with certainty. Prosecutors highlighted the most dramatic version, while defense teams leaned on the more cautious phrasing, each shaping the child's suffering into arguments for their side. Even the question of motive generated conflicting official statements. Early police briefings suggested the crime was tied to personal animosity or gang-related retribution, though no direct evidence ever substantiated those claims. Prosecutors later abandoned that line, instead framing the act as a deeply personal crime without broader affiliations. The shift left some observers wondering whether the original statements had been speculative or designed to control public reaction in the tense days after the rescue. The courts, bound to procedure, seemed at times disconnected from the raw details presented by police and media. In legal filings, the language was stripped down, more sterile, emphasizing statutes and precedents rather than the shocking human elements. This created yet another layer of narrative, one in which the brutal act was abstracted into legal categories, at odds with the visceral accounts shared by rescuers and neighbors. Journalists, combing through these contradictions, pointed out that the story of Angel Torrez was as much about institutional storytelling as it was about the crime itself. Each authority, police, prosecutors, medical staff, courts, had reasons to frame events in specific ways. Together, they produced a patchwork of overlapping truths, none of them wholly false, but none fully aligned. For the public, these inconsistencies became a source of unease. They did not erase the central fact that a boy had been buried alive and survived, but they complicated the narrative of justice. Behind the official story, there was always the possibility of overlooked details, unacknowledged errors, or deliberate framing. Angel's survival was a matter of record, but the way his ordeal was told, by officials, by the press, by the courts, remained fractured. After the trial ended and the headlines began to fade, Angel's recovery became a long, quiet process, carried out away from cameras and reporters. The physical injuries he had suffered were not as visible as broken bones or burns, but they were profound. Doctors explained to his family that being buried had starved his body of oxygen. Even though he survived, the deprivation carried risks that could follow him for years: neurological effects, breathing complications, and the potential for developmental setbacks. At Phoenix Children's Hospital, he was monitored closely in the months after his rescue. He attended regular follow-up visits where specialists measured his oxygen capacity, tracked his cognitive function, and assessed whether his motor skills matched the expectations for a boy his age. His family learned how to watch for subtle signs of trauma in his body: headaches that lasted too long, fatigue that set in without reason, and moments when he seemed to disconnect from the world around him. The physical recovery was only one part of what he faced. Therapists explained that trauma of this scale would not simply vanish as he grew older. He had lived through suffocation, a sensation most children could never imagine, and that memory was likely stored deep within him. Sleep became difficult. Nights often ended with jolts of panic, sometimes triggered by nothing more than the sound of shifting blankets. His family described how he would cling to them tightly, reluctant to be alone in the dark. Professional counseling became a regular part of his life. Child psychologists guided him through play-based therapy and later through structured sessions that allowed him to process fear without reliving it. Still, the progress was uneven. At school, Angel sometimes withdrew from classmates. He found it difficult to explain why ordinary games, burying feet in sand at the playground, hiding beneath blankets, could suddenly overwhelm him with terror. Teachers were briefed discreetly, instructed to watch for signs of distress but to avoid drawing unwanted attention to his struggles. Financial strain shadowed the family throughout this period. Legal proceedings and the costs of therapy compounded the weight they were already carrying. Community donations helped at first, but over time, those resources dwindled, leaving the family to navigate bills on their own. Angel's mother and father took extra shifts, sacrificing rest to ensure their son continued receiving the specialized care he needed. Despite everything, moments of resilience emerged. Angel's survival had marked him, but it had not defined him completely. He returned to playing soccer in neighborhood lots, his laughter echoing again, though sometimes tempered by sudden pauses when memories crept in. Counselors encouraged his family to celebrate these ordinary victories, to see each game, each school project, and each new friendship as proof that recovery was possible, even if it was never complete. By the time he reached his teenage years, Angel carried both scars and strength. The experience had forced him into a maturity that often set him apart from his peers. Friends noticed his quiet seriousness, the way he seemed to measure situations before jumping in. His resilience was evident, but so was the shadow of what he had endured. The boy who had once been headlines was now a young man navigating the complexities of survival, learning that recovery was not a destination but a continuous path. In the years after the rescue, Angel's family became both protectors and interpreters of his story. They understood that his survival carried symbolic weight far beyond their household, but they also recognized that he was still just a boy, trying to grow up without being trapped by the memory of what had happened. His parents balanced the gratitude of strangers with the need to shield him from constant reminders. Interviews grew less frequent as time passed, but every anniversary of the crime brought calls from local reporters. Sometimes the family answered, other times they declined, wary of reopening wounds. Within the community, the image of Angel remained powerful. Neighbors remembered the day he was pulled from the ground, his body fragile but breathing, as a moment that defined the resilience of their block. For some, it was proof of the strength of ordinary citizens who had acted quickly. For others, it was a painful reminder of how violence had invaded a neighborhood filled with children. Murals appeared on walls near the lot where he had been found, painted by local artists as both a tribute to his survival and a demand for safer streets. Churches held vigils on certain anniversaries, calling for prayers not only for Angel but for all children threatened by violence in the city. These gatherings carried a dual tone, one of thanksgiving for the boy's life, and another of mourning for the reality that such an act could occur at all. Angel's name was spoken alongside broader appeals for reform, whether in youth services, neighborhood security, or gang prevention programs. For Angel's extended family, the story became a legacy they could not entirely escape. Cousins at school fielded questions from classmates who had heard versions of the story passed around. Relatives in other cities found themselves explaining that yes, this was the same Angel they had seen in national headlines years earlier. The family alternated between pride that he had endured and weariness at being defined by a single act of cruelty. Public reaction also shaped how institutions responded. Advocacy groups referenced Angel's case when lobbying for child protection measures, using his survival as a rallying cry. Police officials pointed to the rapid rescue as proof of their dedication, while critics used the same case to highlight flaws in early investigations and response times. Over time, the event became less about a single boy and more about what his experience represented. A mirror in which the community projected its fears, hopes, and failures. Despite the attention, Angel himself was often kept away from public events. His parents knew that revisiting the story could re-traumatize him, and they chose instead to let him build as normal a life as possible. They allowed him to see some of the murals and attend some vigils, but never forced him into a role he had not chosen. He was not a spokesperson, not a symbol by choice, just a child who had endured and was trying to live with the weight of survival. As the years stretched further from the day of the rescue, the community's memory softened. New stories, new crises, and new headlines replaced the urgency once attached to his name. Yet in the pockets of Phoenix where people had gathered on that afternoon, where they had watched rescuers pull a boy from the earth, the memory never truly disappeared. Angel remained part of their shared history, a reminder of how fragile and resilient life could be at the same time. As Angel grew older, the weight of his story followed him in ways that were both visible and hidden. To the outside world, he was the boy who had been buried alive and lived. To himself, he was a teenager trying to navigate school, friendships, and the complicated work of becoming his own person. The name Buried Boy surfaced in whispers, sometimes in teasing, sometimes in awe, but always in ways that reminded him he could never fully escape the past. In classrooms, he felt the sharpness of attention when teachers mentioned resilience, trauma, or survival in broader lessons. He sensed eyes on him, classmates recalling what their parents had told them or what they'd read in old headlines. Some tried to be kind, offering words of support. Others wielded the story like a weapon, turning survival into a cruel nickname when fights or arguments broke out. The identity assigned to him by circumstance was inescapable, no matter how hard he tried to just be another face in the room. Counselors encouraged him to reclaim the narrative, to define his survival as part of who he was rather than all of who he was. He listened, sometimes nodding, sometimes resisting. It was difficult to build an identity that wasn't tethered to the day strangers had pulled him from the dirt. Even his own milestones, first jobs, friendships, dreams of adulthood, were often framed by others in contrast to what he had endured. People said he was lucky to be alive, strong for surviving, but rarely asked who he wanted to be beyond the survival. As adolescence gave way to young adulthood, the struggle deepened. Normal challenges of growing up, decisions about education, relationships, and the search for independence were overlaid with the legacy of trauma. Trust came slowly, especially in moments when others tried to get close. At times, Angel withdrew, protecting himself from the risk of vulnerability. At other times, he pushed forward with determination, as if to prove that his life would not be measured solely by a single act of cruelty from his childhood. He encountered moments of empowerment too. Speaking quietly with trusted mentors, he sometimes shared his perspective, not as a headline or cautionary tale, but as a personal truth. In those private spaces, the weight of the story shifted. He was not only the child who had been buried, he was a survivor who could articulate what it meant to carry that memory forward. These conversations allowed him to begin reclaiming his narrative in fragments, shaping it on his own terms. Still, the conflict between public memory and private self never disappeared. In the eyes of many, Angel would always be frozen in time. A small boy carried from the earth, blinking against the light. The man he was becoming often felt invisible beneath that image. Identity, for him, became a lifelong negotiation. A refusal to let trauma erase possibility, even as he knew it would always remain part of the story he carried. As time passed, the story of Angel Torrez shifted from breaking news to historical reference. Reporters who had once rushed to the scene with cameras and notebooks returned years later with different questions. Not about the urgent details of rescue, but about what the case had meant and why it had unfolded the way it did. The frantic coverage of the moment gave way to documentaries, anniversary articles, and quiet retrospectives in local papers. Each retelling sought to place the event within a broader context, framing it less as an isolated crime and more as a symbol of systemic failure and communal resilience. For investigators who had been there on the day of the rescue, memory remained sharp. Some spoke of the haunting image of a small boy being lifted from the ground, dirt clinging to his body as paramedics fought for his breath. Others admitted frustration that questions surrounding the case had never been fully answered. While the immediate focus had been on saving a life, the long-term challenge was explaining how such a crime had happened and who bore responsibility. In interviews years later, retired officers often wrestled with the balance between pride in the rescue and disappointment in the lack of closure. The media, too, underwent its own transformation. In the beginning, headlines had been sensational, highlighting the horror of a child buried alive. Over time, coverage softened, shifting toward human interest stories that emphasized survival and recovery. Documentaries interviewed neighbors, experts, and trauma specialists, framing Angel's story as part of a larger narrative about child safety and community vigilance. In these retellings, the boy was less a victim and more a living reminder of resilience, a symbol of hope in the face of violence. Public memory followed the same arc. At first, people remembered the raw shock, the disbelief that such a crime could occur in their neighborhood. Later, the memory evolved into a cautionary tale, told to emphasize the importance of watching over children, of not dismissing strange behavior or signs of disturbance. Angel's survival became part of local folklore, something parents referenced when warning their children, something communities cited when advocating for safer parks, better patrols, or stronger youth services. Yet, the retrospective framing was never entirely neat. Beneath the praise for survival lingered unresolved questions. Why had no one been convicted? Why had certain investigative leads gone cold? Why had the crime itself faded into the background while the image of rescue was amplified? The retellings comforted the public with a narrative of hope, but they also left room for unease. The story was not only about survival, It was also about a system that had failed to deliver justice in full. In this way, the retrospective framing of Angel's case became layered, at once celebratory and unsettling. It showed how a community and a nation chose to remember an event, not as a clean story with a clear ending, but as a complicated memory that reflected both humanity's ability to save and its inability to fully resolve. When the case of Angel Torrez entered the criminal justice system, the urgency that had driven his rescue seemed to dissolve into the slower, more deliberate machinery of courts and paperwork. Initial arrests were made, suspects questioned, and files compiled. Yet as the months unfolded, the path toward justice became clouded. Court documents revealed inconsistencies between early eyewitness statements, forensic findings, and later testimony. What had been clear in the emotional immediacy of the rescue began to fragment under legal scrutiny. In transcripts preserved from preliminary hearings, attorneys argued fiercely over the reliability of witnesses. Neighbors who had claimed to see suspicious figures near the vacant lot wavered when pressed on details. Some admitted the chaos of the day had blurred their memory. Others retracted earlier claims altogether, saying they had been confused or pressured. The absence of physical evidence tying any individual directly to the act of burying Angel deepened the problem. Soil samples, fingerprints, and possible tool marks produced no conclusive matches. Official records also exposed procedural gaps. Officers admitted that the site had not been fully secured in the hours following the rescue. Curious onlookers and media had moved freely in and out of the area before a complete forensic sweep was conducted. This lapse undermined later attempts to establish a clean chain of evidence. Defense attorneys seized on these errors, arguing that the state could not prove its case beyond reasonable doubt. The prosecutorial strategy reflected this uncertainty. Rather than pursue a straightforward narrative of guilt, the state hedged its arguments, introducing multiple theories about who could have been responsible. Some prosecutors hinted at gang involvement, citing the area's reputation for youth violence. Others suggested a personal vendetta, though no clear motive was ever established. The lack of a single coherent theory weakened the state's case, and jurors, already cautious about sending someone to prison on circumstantial evidence, grew hesitant. Ultimately, the case never resulted in a lasting conviction. Charges were dropped in some instances, reduced in others. Files show motions for dismissal citing insufficient evidence, and judges reluctantly agreeing. What remained was a legal record filled with starts and stops, a portrait not of resolution, but of a system unable to translate the horror of the crime into accountability. For Angel's family, the paperwork was another wound. Reading transcripts and rulings, they saw the stark difference between what they had lived and what the law could prove. The boy who had been buried alive was undeniable, but the identity of those who had done it remained elusive in official terms. That gap between lived truth and legal record haunted them for years. Publicly, these shortcomings were less visible. Few outside legal circles examined the dense files, and media often glossed over the discrepancies, preferring to focus on Angel's survival rather than the failures of prosecution. Yet within the court archives, the case stands as a reminder of how easily justice can falter, not from lack of will, but from the fragile structure of evidence, procedure, and memory. In the years after the case faded from courtrooms and headlines, Angel Torrez's story began to take on a different life in public memory. Though no lasting conviction was secured, the fact that a young boy had been buried alive and survived carried a symbolic weight that extended beyond the incident itself. His survival was cited in speeches, used in policy debates, and woven into discussions about child protection and community safety. Local leaders frequently invoked the case when pressing for stronger laws around child endangerment and stricter sentencing for violent crimes against minors. The image of Angel's small body being lifted from the earth appeared in community forums and legislative hearings as a stark reminder of what could happen when children were left vulnerable. Advocacy groups working on behalf of victims of violence referenced the case in campaign materials, framing it as evidence of why reforms were urgently needed. The story also found a place in academic and professional discussions. Criminologists cited it in studies on the failures of the justice system, pointing to the gaps in evidence collection and witness reliability. Social workers and trauma specialists referred to Angel's survival when training professionals to recognize the long-term impact of childhood violence. In these circles, the boy was not reduced to a headline but became a reference point for systemic weaknesses and the resilience of victims. At the community level, Angel's story lingered as a kind of cautionary tale. Parents recalled it when teaching their children about safety. Neighbors cited it when pushing for improved street lighting or better surveillance in neglected areas. Memorial events for victims of crime occasionally included Angel's name, not as someone lost, but as someone who embodied survival against the odds. In this sense, his story became a tool for building solidarity, a reminder of both danger and endurance. Yet the way his case was remembered also reflected deeper tensions. Advocates sometimes simplified the story to strengthen their arguments, focusing on the horror of the crime while omitting the unresolved questions of justice. Lawmakers cited his name to justify stricter laws, while critics pointed out that the very system which had failed to secure accountability was the same system being empowered. In this way, Angel's survival was not just a personal memory, it became a contested symbol, used differently depending on the agenda of those invoking it. Despite these divergences, the story endured in public discourse because it contained both tragedy and hope. The crime revealed human cruelty, the rescue revealed human bravery, and the survival revealed the possibility of healing, however incomplete. That combination gave it lasting power, ensuring that even as legal records gathered dust, the memory of a boy pulled from the ground continued to echo in policy debates, advocacy campaigns, and the collective imagination of the community that had once held its breath for him. Angel Torrez grew older under the shadow of what had been done to him, carrying a past that was never far away no matter how much time passed. Survival had given him life, but it had also marked him. The act of being buried alive in childhood left scars that did not fade when the news cameras turned away or when the courts failed to deliver justice. For him, each reminder of enclosed spaces, each sound that echoed the muffled silence of dirt pressing down, brought back fragments of memory that no therapy could entirely erase. Psychologists who later studied cases like his often described it as a form of complex trauma, where the child learns to live with hypervigilance and a nervous system trained by fear. His life became an ongoing negotiation with those memories, a daily balance between what he had endured and the person he was trying to become. The burden was not his alone. His family lived with a dual weight: gratitude that he had survived, and grief at what had been stolen from him. Parents and siblings were pulled into cycles of anxiety, watching for signs of pain, fearing every setback as if it might undo his fragile resilience. Families of child survivors often report living in two worlds: the ordinary, where bills and meals must be managed, and the extraordinary, where each quiet night can still bring nightmares. Each school challenge can still be traced back to trauma. In Angel's household, that duality shaped the years to come. They learned how to be protectors, but they also carried the helplessness of knowing they could not protect him from what had already been done. Communities, too, felt the impact. In the neighborhood where the rescue had taken place, parents told and retold the story as both a warning and a testament. Children grew up hearing how a boy from their own streets had been forced into the ground yet pulled back to life. For some, it was a source of pride that he had survived. For others, it remained an open wound, a reminder of how violence could erupt from the familiar corners of daily life. Community advocates cited his case when demanding more safety measures, using his survival to argue for after-school programs, mental health resources, and stronger protections for children. His name was invoked long after the police reports had faded from circulation. Experts who examined the case in later years often pointed out that it revealed both the fragility of children under violence and the fragility of the systems meant to protect them. Trauma specialists noted that recovery for survivors like Angel was rarely linear. It came in fragments, with moments of progress and sudden returns of fear. Criminologists highlighted how the case exposed procedural weaknesses, lost evidence, unreliable witnesses, and courts unable to turn moral certainty into legal conviction. Ethicists raised questions about how the media handled such stories, sometimes sensationalizing survival while avoiding the uncomfortable reality that justice had never been delivered. In the wider culture, Angel's story became part of a broader archive of child survival stories, placed alongside other cases where children endured cruelty yet lived. Documentaries, news retrospectives, and even academic studies referenced him not just as a victim, but as a symbol of survival against odds. Yet his story resisted simplification. It was not only about triumph. It was also about a legal system that stumbled, a family that carried invisible burdens, and a community that learned resilience by necessity. Each retelling balanced between inspiration and indictment, between the miracle of his survival and the failure to bring answers. Comparisons to similar cases in history often drew out lessons. In the United States and abroad, there were other children who had been trapped, buried, or hidden away, and their stories echoed angels in different ways. Some cases ended in tragedy, others in miraculous rescue. By placing them side by side, scholars and advocates highlighted patterns, failures of social systems, the role of neighbors and bystanders, the decisive moments when one call or one intervention determined life or death. In that comparative lens, Angel's case was not an isolated horror but part of a recurring pattern that demanded structural change. As the years went on, what remained was not a single clear conclusion but a series of unresolved questions. How could justice fail so completely even when the crime was undeniable? How much healing was truly possible for a child marked by such violence? How should a society remember such a story? By celebrating survival, by condemning the cruelty, or by holding both truths at once? Angel Torrez's name never became as widely known as some victims of crime. Yet within the records, the neighborhoods, and the memories of those who had lived through it, his story endured as both warning and testament. In the end, the boy who had been buried alive survived not only the crime but the years that followed, though survival did not mean forgetting. His life became a living archive of trauma and resilience, of systemic failure and human endurance. For his family and community, he was both a child who had once been pulled from the earth and an adult who carried that past in silence. For those who studied or cited his case, he was proof that survival does not end the story. It only begins a longer, harder reckoning. And for history, his story stood as an unsettled reminder that justice may falter, that memory may distort, but that the truth of what he endured could never be erased. And that's where this story leaves us, with more questions than answers, and a reminder of how fragile survival can be. If you found yourself drawn into this journey, make sure to subscribe to Eternal Obsidian for more stories that linger in the shadows and refuse to be forgotten.